My case, my custom, my practice, my something. I'd like to begin with our review from last week. So last week we were in chapter 11, and we saw Peter returning to Jerusalem from Caesarea after he had converted Cornelius and Cornelius' family and the friends that were at his house. We noted that the Jews had already heard about this activity and were upset because Peter had associated with these Gentile heathens. Peter defended his position, and we saw that by sharing the vision that he had had and also explaining to them Cornelius' encounter with the angel from the Lord. That seemed to cause them to have at least softened their hearts so that they then accepted and acknowledged that it must be from God and that God intended for these Gentiles to be part of God's saving plan. And so they were open to that. We then noted that Luke took us back to the time that Stephen was stoned, some 8 or 9 years previous to the time that we're currently at, and reminds how the Christians were scattered and went to many different places, teaching Jesus about that saving grace to the Jews, only to the Jews at that point in time. So then Luke told us that some of the men from Cyprus and Cyrene came to Antioch and began sharing the gospel with the Greeks, thus presenting Jesus to the Gentiles. Bill, he mentioned that he thought maybe it was the folks from Caesarea that might have gone up there. And of course, the answer to that is it's clearly possible because it's much closer for them. But Luke tells us that these guys from Cyprus and Cyrene were there doing that. So we know that they were there. It's possible that the ones from Caesarea who had already been presented the gospel could have gone to Antioch as well. We then learned that a large number of these people turned to the Lord and the church continued to grow. So that's what we've been seeing through our study, a continuation from the day of Pentecost on of how the church is continuing to grow, continuing to add members, continuing to get bigger, and more people becoming Christians as opposed to the life of the law of Moses. We saw that the news about all of this reached back to Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to provide encouragement and support to the folks in Antioch. Once Barnabas had provided that encouragement, he decided that he needed to go to Tarsus and find and bring Saul back to Antioch. And having accomplished that, he and Saul stayed in Antioch for a year, preaching and teaching about Jesus to the Gentiles. And once again, the church continued to grow and prosper. And then at the end of the last week, we were introduced to a prophet by the name of Agabus, who warned of an impending famine. And because of this, the Christians in Antioch took up a collection, and they gave that collection to Saul and Barnabas to take to the Judean churches, and Luke says that they gave it to the elders of those different Judean churches so that the elders could then disseminate that collection. And that's where we left off. Any questions from last week that we need to address before we move on to today's lesson? Hearing none, Charles has agreed to offer our prayer today, so thank you. Let's pray.
Holy and righteous Father in heaven, we thank you for the beautiful day you've given to us, for the beautiful week that we've had, for this opportunity to meet again to study your word and to worship you today. And we thank you for the exciting story of the beginning of your church as Dave is teaching us, and we pray you bless him for the work that he has put in on this teaching, and open our hearts to listen and hear and to be inspired by the example of those first Christians. Bless us all as we listen, as we gather our thoughts together to think about these important things and Dave as he teaches us. Bless him again, Lord, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Charles. And Steve has volunteered again to get some exercise, so if you have a comment today or want to make a comment, please just raise your hand and he'll bring you the microphone. Okay, so chapter 12. This opens up to say that about at the same time that Saul and Barnabas were delivering the contribution. So this is kind of running concurrent to them coming back to Judea and meeting with those Judean churches. This event is also happening, that the Herod, the king, laid hands on some of the Christians and sort of took over that Saul, when he was persecuting the church, I sort of thought that this looked like the same activity that Saul was doing, except this guy was a king and he was able to kill them. This Herod is Agrippa the First. He's the grandson of Herod the Great, and you'll remember as we go back a little bit in time, thinking about the Herods, Herod the Great was the king during Jesus' time. He was the king that ordered all of the male babies 2 years and younger to be killed, hoping to include Jesus in that effort. And so this is the grandson now of that guy. And we're going to run across, someday we're going to run across Agrippa II, which is the son of this guy, which he comes into play at the end of Acts as Paul makes a defense in front of him. So, historians tell us that Agrippa ruled over the same territory. Agrippa I ruled over the same territory as his grandfather for 3 years, AD 41 to 44. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we move through our class. So the next question is, who's this James guy? And he had James, the brother of John, put to death. Okay, so James, we have in the New Testament 3 James listed. Well, we already know one of them has just been executed. This guy's been executed, brother of John, put to death. Well, we can easily go back to Matthew and find out which James this is. It's because he's the brother of John. And so as we remember when Jesus began his ministry and began finding disciples, he came across these fishing friends, fishing guys, and James and John, the son of Zebedee. So that's the James that was killed in this particular case. So that was pretty good. Historians tell us that James was beheaded. However, there were some that suggested that Jewish law, there were only a couple of violations under Jewish law that allowed for beheading. Most of the time they were run through based upon Jewish law. But Romans, on the other hand, they always did the beheading business, and so the commentators felt as though it's most likely that he was probably beheaded because of Herod adhering to Roman law. Now, it's somewhat speculative in my view, but then I say, does it matter? The guy was dead. The guy was killed. James became the first apostle that was martyred. And that's probably the most important for us to recognize. The manner in which he was killed probably is, while it's interesting, probably isn't that important to us to absolutely, positively know whether he was run through or he was beheaded. He was killed, and he was a martyr. He was the first apostle that was martyred. So, verse 3 talks about when he saw that pleased, he being Herod, pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter. So the character of Agrippa was trying to have everyone that he thought was in power to like him. His character was, I want everybody to like me. at least the ones that mean anything to me. And so, because these rebellious Jews vacillated to him and sort of recognized him as being a wonderful guy, because he was doing their bidding for all practical purposes, they liked him. He liked them to like him, and so consequently he was happy to do the things that he did. And so scholars also said that he was well thought of by Caesar, and that sort of falls into that character. He was going to do those things that made Caesar pleased with him and happy with him, and so that was just the way he was. He was trying to please those that were in power and had power. So then we see that because the Jews were pleased to have James killed, it only seemed appropriate to arrest Peter in his mind. And then it talks about the days of unleavened bread. And we'll remember from our Old Testament study, the Passover and the days of unleavened bread go together. You have one day of the Passover, and then you have 7 days of the unleavened bread, and that becomes called the Passover feast. So it's all referred to typically as the Passover. Luke specifically talks about this because we're talking about a week's period of time. And so we're going to see that because of Herod's desire to make the people happy, he's not going to kill Peter or execute Peter during this period of, in their view, a festival, a period of time where they allegedly are honoring God because of the Passover feast. So verse 4, we see that very idea that he put him in prison, delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers. The idea behind 4 squads of soldiers is that there would be 4 soldiers on each shift, if you will. They called it the periods of time, so 3 hours at a time, these 4 squads of soldiers, typically 2 inside the jail, 2 outside the jail, and we'll refer to that in a little bit as he gets away or he escapes because of God. So Peter was left in prison rather than immediately being killed, and that was because of the Passover. If Agrippa had killed him during that sacred week, it would be an offense, I think, offensive to the Jews, and Agrippa was all about pleasing them to make himself look even better. And so he chose to wait until the Passover was done. So 2 soldiers in, 2 soldiers out. I got to chase a rabbit here. So just for a second, this verse 4, as we go back to verse 4, you can see that in the New American Standard, intending after the Passover to bring him out of the people, out before the people. Passover, that's the word I want us to look at. And the reason that I'm chasing this rabbit is because I know some of you use King James Version Bibles. Well, the King James Version Bible interprets this word, Passover, as Easter. And I just want to bring that forward to say that I think the translators have missed the translation of the Greek word Pascha. And why they used Easter here, I have no idea. But I will say that Passover is used 29 times. This word Pascha is used 29 times throughout the New Testament. And each time it's interpreted as Passover, not Easter, except for this one verse in this one translation, the King James. And so if you happen to be using the King James, I would submit to you that this concept of Easter is while it is a Western holiday, we have grown accustomed to Easter throughout many years. Easter's a big holiday that's represented for us. But I think that the King James misinterprets it. And so I found in Vine's dictionary, W.E. Vine writes this, and I think this is useful too. Usage notes. Mistranslated Easter in Acts 12:4. AV is the authorized version. That was Church of England version. Denotes the Passover. The RV is the revised version of the Church of England. The phrase after the Passover signifies after the whole festival was at an end. The term Easter is not of Christian origin. It is another form of Astarte, one of the titles of the Chaldean goddess, the Queen of Heaven. The festival of Pasch, held by Christians in post-apostolic times, was a continuation of the Jewish feast, but was not instituted by Christ, nor was it connected with Lent. From this Pasch, the pagan festival of Easter was quite distinct and was introduced into the apostate Western religion as part of the attempt to adapt pagan festivals to Christianity. So here's W.E. Vine, and again, we don't hold him out to be inspired, but it does seem that he's pretty harsh with regards to the King James Version interpreting this word to be Easter. So just be cautious, I think. Scholars were consistent to say that the early Christians had no Easter celebration, and if the Christians had this Easter celebration, Agrippa would have cared less, because his point was to win the approval of the Jews, not the Christians. And so if this was really a real festival based upon Easter, Agrippa would have not worried about that. He would have just killed Peter immediately. So that was a good thing. Shelby, go right ahead.
I don't know if it's I don't know if it's noteworthy or not, but the New King James has it as Passover.
Oh, the New King James does? I missed that. So my fault, because I thought I looked at all of them, even all of a lot of the very common, more, in my view, liberal Bible stuff you read, they're all using Passover as well. So thank you for that comment. Appreciate it. The reference, of course, here is not for a Christian holy day, but to a Jewish one. And that's why Agrippa would have not killed Peter during that particular time. So that's my rabbit. Any other comments or questions about that? All right, so done chasing rabbits. Back to verse 5. Though Peter was in prison, hope was not lost. The brethren were praying for him. And that's something that we see regularly with this first century church. They do a lot of praying. And so that's a good example, I think, for us to be able to recognize the importance of prayer. And I think that we do, but at the same time, we can always improve, I'm guessing. So that was this example. They were fervently, as it says, prayers being offered on his behalf. So, powerless within themselves against the might of the king, they invoked a far greater power. So they're looking for God to help them help Peter and get him out of this terrible situation. Verse 6, Herod's ready to go. The Passover is completed now. That festival has been completed. It's time to call Peter out from the prison and put him on trial, which would have been a puppet trial, because the whole point of that would be to execute him to please the Jews. And so Herod was ready to go, and so this was the night before that going to be taking place. So he's waited until the Passover, and it's time for that trial and that execution. So Peter was sleeping between two soldiers on the night before. Scholars say that the custom was for 2 soldiers to chain themselves, one on either side of the prisoner, and the other 2 were to be stationed outside the prison door, the jail door, I should say. And so the idea, if you can picture one guy over here with his arm chained to Peter, and the other guy on this side, and the other arm chained to. That's the picture, I think, for our minds to come up. That's at least the picture of most of the scholars of what they would basically say. So what we have here is we have pretty much an inescapable situation. Now, of course, Houdini, we've watched him no, let me back that up. I'm told by my grandparents that Houdini did lots of escape artist, type of thing. This is not the case here, I don't think. We're pretty certain, based upon the next verse, what happened. The angel comes in and appears before Peter, hits him on the side, says, "Wake up, we got to go," and found this crazy picture of this angel waking Peter up, and the alleged picture of the guards sleeping. I think these, and we're going to have another picture similar to that showing guards sleeping. I think with the guards sleeping, that kind of takes away a little bit, at least for me, God's power. Did they have to be asleep for Peter to get out of there? Of course not. But the pictures you see, they're all, allegedly asleep. And so I just say, okay, that's a picture. There's no real yes or no to that picture, other than it's a picture and it kind of puts something in your mind. So an angel appeared, accompanied by a light, struck Peter on the side to wake him up, told him to stand up, and as he did, the chains fell off. So that's what's happened here. Here's this other picture, or another one. Angel said, "Get up, dress yourself, get dressed, put your coat on, let's go." And so that's kind of what is taking place with that particular verse. The next verse says, "And he went out and followed him. He did not know what was being done, because he was thinking that this was not real, that this was another vision." And as obviously Peter is being obedient to this angel and doing what the angel tells him to do, but he thinks that it's a vision. He doesn't think that it's real. And so as we think back to chapter 10, we can kind of get an idea why he would think that, because that's what we studied with regards to his vision about the Gentiles. It was a vision, and he saw all of these things, and so it just makes sense that he would think that this was another vision, as opposed to something that's really happening. And so I sort of get the idea why he would be a bit confused at this point. In 10, we see, here's these are jailers again sleeping. In 10, they pass by the guards outside. Seemingly God supernaturally acted on these guards. And again, were they asleep? We don't know. It's all speculation. What we do know is God got them out, got Peter out of that prison, and the guards didn't know it, didn't recognize it. And so clearly God's involved with this. Once Peter was out of the jail, he and the angel came to the iron gate leading into the city. This gate was more than likely to keep the Jews away from the Romans, as opposed to the Romans getting into the city. And the historians, the scholars talk about the Romans had a certain section of Jerusalem that was only for Romans. They call that Antonia. And you can look that up, and if you want to. I don't want to spend the time to go through all of that. I don't know if it's how beneficial that would be, but that's where the Romans were. And this gate would be basically going outside of the Roman section and into the regular city of Jerusalem. Again, I viewed it as more keeping the Jews out from the Romans as opposed to the Romans away from the Jews, just vice versa. God opened that gate for them, and it just automatically opened. Kind of like when we push the button out here and the door automatically opens. Same kind of a scenario. So God clearly was part of this effort. So once they got out, Peter came to himself. Of course, the angel got him out to the street. They went down to one street, and the angel left. And then Peter came to himself. And I think that it is no wonder to me that he thought that he had seen the vision. He clearly understood that death was knocking at his door because of where he was, and the likelihood of him escaping wasn't even in his mind. He only thought about, what had happened to James, and now that was probably going to happen to him. Both Stephen and James, he had seen, been at least recognized, both of this had been martyred. And now it was him. It was his turn for that. Only a miracle of God could prevent that. And that's exactly what's happened. Until the angel left, Peter had thought that this whole episode was simply a vision. But now, standing alone in the street, he had time to think about the situation, and I think he realized that he had been delivered out of the hands of Herod and the Jews, and ultimately he was delivered from death. And so once he realized that and thought about, okay, now what do I do? Verse 12, he goes and says, hey, I need to go to Mary's house. And so once he realized that, God delivered him out of the hand of Herod, and he went to Mary's house. One commentary said, it's probable that the disciples were accustomed to meeting at the house of Mary, so Peter's mind worked rapidly, and he decided to go and find protection and companionship there. Again, that's a commentary. That's not found in the Bible. Luke doesn't give us that description, but it does make, in my view, make some sense that could very well have been what was racing through his mind at that time. So I think that the commentary could be correct. And then this is our first introduction to a guy by the name of John Mark. And we're going to say more about him later, so I don't want to spend the time today to talk about John Mark, but we'll talk about him as we proceed with the book of Acts. And once again, we see this pattern that the first century Christians had. Here they are again praying, coming together in prayer. So that's truly a pattern that we need to imitate, if you will. And so then the next thing that came to my mind was, okay, this Mary person, Mary seems to be a very common name, and certainly a common name in the New Testament. And so I did a little research I used the Gospel Advocate commentaries, and I found six Marys. John 19, there's a Mary, the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, and of course this is just one verse. There's a lot of verses that talks about Mary Magdalene, so she's common to us. Mary, the mother of John Mark, that's the one we're talking about today. Mary, of course, the sister of Lazarus, and we have a lot of knowledge about her as well. Mary, this one was kind of obscure, Roman Christian, and found in Romans 16:6. Just a faithful Christian there in Rome. And then Mary, of course, the mother of Jesus. So there's at least 6 Marys that this commentary identified to talk about the different Marys. So when you read about a Mary, you kind of have to do a little bit of research to figure out, okay, which Mary is this? Because it's a common name. All right. So verse 13 and 14. So Peter comes to his senses, and he says, I got to go to Mary's house. So he gets to Mary's house, knocks on the door, and the doors, what the scholars said was typical Jewish house. And they said that Mary probably had a large house for that time of the world, I guess. And it would likely have had a courtyard before the actual going inside the door. And so Peter's out here on the courtyard probably knocking on the door. And then the other thing that we're used to, of course, is walking up to somebody's house and pushing the doorbell and waiting for somebody to come up. In those days, according again to the scholars, in those days it was knock on the door and then announce yourself and call out for somebody to come and get you. And that's why we see Rhoda, who came and recognized Peter's voice. And so that's how we get to the voice portion of, in our logic of, going and pushing a doorbell. We don't typically announce who we are normally, unless we're the police breaking down the door, and then we just say police. But that was kind of the idea. So I suppose this is one way, in my view, that Luke interjects a bit of humor. Rhoda recognizes his voice, but didn't let him in. Rather, she runs back to the other brethren and told them Peter was at the door. Well, of course, next verse tells us about what their response to that. You are crazy. You are nuts. It's not possible. He's in jail and there's no way he's getting out of jail. And so the brethren just thought that Rhoda was out of her mind. And she kept insisting that, yes, I heard him. And they said, that's not possible. It's just not possible. And the brethren said that it had to be Peter's angel. So that then brings up the question about this angel business. And I don't want to chase this rabbit very far. So some of you might have questions or comments about this. But apparently in Jewish custom, it was understood from the Jewish custom that individuals had like guardian angels, kind of like what the Catholic Church suggests that everybody has. And so the scholars were saying that it's likely that the brethren were thinking about their Jewish history and that the Jews recognized that, or at least believed, that people had guardian angels. And so that's how they introduced this concept of angel. Now, is that true or not? I don't know for sure, other than what the scholars say. But that's kind of what how this angel thing comes about. And so I share that with you to say I don't know if that's absolutely the positive answer. That's what some of the scholars said. Questions or comments? Oh, yeah. Good. Charles, you got your own microphone. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that the group must be praying for Peter's life. And when he comes to the door, they don't believe it's even possible, which says a lot about their faith at this particular point.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point. They're praying, and then he shows up and they don't recognize it. I think that's a great point, Charles. Oh, there's Nolan. Maybe just throw that microphone right over the top of that pew. Or maybe just hand it. You don't have to throw it.
It won't change the message here in this chapter at all, in this lesson at all. But I'm wondering, do we know this Herod Agrippa that put James to death? Mm-hmm. Do we know, would that be the same Agrippa that the Apostle Paul was talking to at one time, teaching him about Jesus? And Agrippa says, I'm paraphrasing, go your way, Paul, for another day, because you almost persuaded me to be a Christian. Would that be the same Agrippa?
Yeah, you're taking away my lesson in about 10 weeks.
Sorry.
It is not the same Agrippa. It is the son of this Agrippa. That is Agrippa number 2. Agrippa number 2. So that's a good comment, Nolan. Thank you for that. Okay, so here we go. Rhoda's continuing to insist. And while the brethren were inside, I wrote, debating whether Peter was at the door. Peter continued to knock, and finally they opened the door, I guess. They just gave up of debating back and forth that this was not Peter. So finally they opened the door, and surprise, surprise, there he is. And so no doubt they were amazed and flabbergasted, I guess. And so they they were all excited about that. And so the next verse says, and Peter motioning with his hand, shh, be quiet, we don't want to wake up the neighbors. You know, we're talking about, this is way early in the morning hours, you know, maybe, who knows, 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, maybe a little later than that. We don't know, that's all speculation. But it's early in the morning. It's before sunlight. And we know that because of the next verse, because we're going to come to when sunlight actually happens. So we know that it's not sunlight. I'm guessing that Peter's trying to say, hey, be quiet, because we don't want to wake up anybody. We don't want to make a disturbance. I just escaped out of jail. I don't want to be caught by some Roman. And Larry's over there. I'm sorry, Larry, where did our microphone guy go? Oh, he's right there. I'm sorry. So, my fault, Larry. So anyway, that's the concept here. Go ahead, Larry.
Well, just going to say, with regard to the brethren's inability to believe that Peter was released, when in fact that's what they were praying for, I can imagine that they were praying that the trial the next day would go well, that something would intervene in that way, that he would be released. But God had other plans to answer their prayers, and we should have confidence that God can find ways to answer our prayers in ways we cannot imagine.
Absolutely. That is a great comment. Thank you, Larry. Absolutely true. Okay, so this says that at the end of this verse, it says that Peter went to another place. We don't know where that's at. Luke doesn't tell us where that's at. Certainly it was most likely a place that he wouldn't be found by the Romans that are going to be looking for him shortly. We just don't know where he went. So he went away. And so we're back to the idea that he says that take this report to James. Well, we just had a James killed, so who's this James? And I think if we look at that, we could see that this James is the son of Alphaeus, and that is James, or, no, there's 2 James left, the son of Alphaeus and James, Jesus' brother. And so this is most likely James, Jesus' brother. And that's based upon Galatians 1:19 and Acts 15:13, which talks about a James that was actually in Jerusalem at that particular time, and that James was Jesus' brother. And so that's who the commentators at least believe of this particular James. And that, again, makes sense to me, so we can go with that. Next verse. Next now, here we're coming to the day now. Now when day came, there was no small disturbance. Well, the soldiers said, hey, where was he? He was hooked right to me, and now I don't see him. And so can you imagine what was going on in the city when Peter was nowhere to be found? That had to be just a crazy period of time, as those soldiers who knew that they were going to have to answer for this, no doubt are looking intently. This was, of course, the day that Peter was to be tried and executed, yet they couldn't find him. Where'd he go? Where did he go? So I wrote, bewildered, panicked soldiers must have been scurrying all over town looking for Peter. And I'm guessing that they were not happy with what was going on. Well, here's a guy that was really not happy, and that was Herod. So Herod, when he learned that Peter was missing, he ordered a search. But, of course, to no avail. They couldn't find Peter. And he questioned the guards. He brought them in, talked to them. They couldn't provide any explanation of where Peter was or how he even escaped. And so that left Herod no choice but to simply follow Roman law and kill the guards. And so that's what he did. The guards were held accountable, even though there was no real explanation of how he could have gotten away. And then the verse says that Herod left from Judea and went to Caesarea, or Jerusalem to Caesarea. So here's our map, and that one's kind of hard to see. Down here's Jerusalem. Caesarea is where he went. We're going to talk shortly about Tyre and Sidon, and that they're located right there. There's a little bit bigger map. Jerusalem, Caesarea, Tyre and Sidon. So they're all over, these cities are all over by the coast, just a little bit north of each other. So, verse 20, it says that he was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. Luke doesn't give us any clue of why that was. And, of course, based upon that, the scholars were unclear either. They just said, we don't know. So we don't know why he was angry with them. But apparently he was. And according to the scholars, Tyre and Sidon were trading seaports. And of course, as we saw on the map, how close they were to the ocean, to the Mediterranean. So certainly that would make sense. And much of the goods shipped at these points passed through Galilee. Herod could divert a great deal of it to Caesarea or Joppa. Phoenicia was so populous that it depended on neighbors for food. And that's the key of what's going to happen next. So this talks about these guys appearing the representatives of Tyre and Sidon because the king was mad at them. They went to the king's chamberlain, Blastus, and convinced him to help them. And again, we don't have any real, Luke doesn't provide us any insight on what they did to have him help them or why he even helped them. Most of the scholars would say it's likely they gave him a bribe of some form or another to get him to agree to help them, to try to get the king to ease up and allow them to have the food that they needed, because that's what they were out of based upon the other verse. So it's clear that the reasons were due to needy food. So appointed day, Herod, having put on the royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address. Luke doesn't tell us, again, why Herod decided to give this speech. Historians will talk about a festival, and the guy that talks about it the most is our friend Josephus. And we'll remember studying about Josephus many times, or him being mentioned. We didn't study Josephus. He just mentioned because he is a non-Christian historian that is writing history. And so in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, this happens to show up. And so all of the scholars pointed back to this thing. And so I don't think you can probably read all of this, but let me sneak away, and I'm going to read this to you because I think it's pretty interesting. So now when Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Judea, he came to the city Caesarea, which was formerly called Stratos Tower. And there he exhibited shows in honor of Caesar, upon his being informed that there was a certain festival celebrated to make vows for his safety. At which festival a great multitude was gotten together of the principal persons and such as were of dignity through his province. On the second day of which shows he put on a garment made wholly of silver, and I'm out of time, I'll hurry, and of a contexture truly wonderful, and came into the theater early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, shone out after a surprising manner. And based upon time, I will stop there because there's another page to read about that and bring that back up next week. But what's going to happen, what we're going to see here is that Josephus confirms what Luke wrote. And I think that's always good, and that's probably why the scholars brought Josephus into their assessment of this particular verse, because of the confirming nature of Josephus's writing to confirm what Luke had written. Thank you all. I'm sorry we didn't get quite through that chapter, but we'll get there next week. Thank you for all your comments and questions, and we'll see you next week. Appreciate your time.